That's no moon.
Clear Bay 327. We are opening the magnetic field.
Hello there, and welcome to Docking Bay 327. Today, we're going to look at how I completed my Ottoman for my Falcon bench back here. This video is a little longer than my average videos, but I didn't want to leave anything out because there's a lot of good content, and there's a lot of things that I kind of skipped over during the actual bench build video that I thought you might find useful. This video is meant to be complimentary to the Falcon bench build video. And if you haven't seen that, you can take a look at it up here or in the description below. But just as my Ottoman complements my bench, I'll put in chapter markers so you can jump ahead to the content if there's something specific that you want to look at, or if you want to come back later and, you know, refresh your memory. I know I do that a lot with a lot of the other makers' videos here on YouTube. Normally I wouldn't say just skip right ahead, but in this case I did want to make the content useful for you and meaningful. If you haven't subscribed already, if you would take just a moment to click that big red subscribe button, it makes a huge difference and will really help grow my channel. And get it out there to even more Star Wars geeks like us. So I would appreciate that very much. If you want to be notified of future videos that I post, you can click the little alert bell and fill that in, and that way each time I push a new video out, you will get an alert on your phone, your computer, whatever. Enough chit chat, let's get right into it. So here's a very memorable scene from Star Wars: A New Hope. Luke is sitting on the Ottoman part of the Millennium Falcon bench. And here's one of the few reference shots I could find. Back in October of last year, 2021, I built the frame of the Ottoman while I was building the bench. I decided to put it aside so I could focus on just the Falcon bench, and then the HD foam was unavailable when I finished the bench, so I had to wait until it was back in stock. The frame is almost identical to the bench minus the taller sides. I used masonite board for the shell and some styrene on the front curves. Once I was able to order more HD foam, I used an 8mm piece as the skin. I applied contact cement to both the masonite and the bottom of the foam. I used plain printer paper as a template so I could run the foam skin up to the back curve where the control panel was going to go. I then used a piece of 24mm HD foam for the seat cushions. I again used plain printer paper to drape over the seat area, drew out the shapes, and cut out the templates. A silver Sharpie worked well to trace the templates onto the black foam, and cut out the cushions with a sharp razor knife. It left some rough edges, but it was easy enough to sand those out. Next, I used a 1-inch router bit to round over all the edges to match the look of the bench. Side note, this roundover process makes a huge mess. Even with a dust collector, you will still have to clean up the area when you're finished. It gets everywhere too, so you'll want to be sure and wear a respirator the whole time. I then sanded the edges, ran my heat gun over it to seal it, then sanded and sealed a couple more times for each pad. I also learned from my bench pads to use my heat gun to bend the pads in advance and use rubber bands to keep the curved shape. This made attaching the pads to the seat much less painful. I also cut out the control panel base using my go-to chalkboard MDF and did a quick test fit. Now comes my favorite part of every build. It's Greebly time. I began with those iconic rocker switches. and I needed a lot of them. Thankfully, I had planned ahead and cast a whole bunch of them out of resin. For a lot of the other Greeblies, I used rivet nuts placed on the surface upside down. For the main ring Greebly, I started with a piece I pulled from an old rear projection TV. But then I remembered I still had some scrap parts from my droid socket kit that I had purchased from the smuggler's room. This ring worked much better. So glad I kept the leftover pieces. I rummaged through my plumbing fittings for the last few Greeblies. I also had my master Greebly from the bench, which had some really cool pieces. So I pulled a couple of those off and used them as well. That's the beauty of making a mold like that. You can then reuse the same Greeblies for multiple projects. Once I had all the Greeblies I needed, I went back to the frame and built out the mounting brackets for the control panel. Next, I began the primer and painting. I started with a coat of flat gray primer over the entire top of the Ottoman. I laid out some of the Greeblies and gave them a nice silver metallic finish to look like they were made of metal. I left those to cure and went back to the Ottoman. Masking off the seat area, I then covered the control panel box with a gloss black. Next, I glued down the seat pads using the same contact cement process as I used on the bench. I gave them a coat of primer, and then it was time to apply the tan plasti dip I used on the bench so it would all be cohesive. When using this spray plasti dip, I had to get a lot closer to the surface than the standard spray paint in order to get good coverage. It also had a tendency to get kind of drippy, so I had to apply several passes before it was completely coated. Once it had fully cured, I laid out all my Greeblies. Don't you just love the dramatic lighting on this shot? Usually, I put the pinstriping on last, but for this, I wanted to use the pinstriping as a guide for gluing down the Greeblies in their final location. This took me a lot of trial and error and takes a pretty steady hand to line up the edges cleanly. From there, I simply applied CA glue to each Greebly and attached them all. Sanding the bottom of the rocker switches gave the glue something to stick to. For the back shell, I used that same chalkboard MDF. I put a scrap piece underneath and marked it across the panel top so that when I cut it to size, it would attach just below the top lip. Quick tip: when cutting with a jigsaw, if you cut the back side of the board, the front will have a nice, clean edge. I normally use masonite board for anything that bends, but I decided to give it a try, and it worked great. The bend was just gradual enough that I could just screw it into place. One of the last steps was to make the side panels. For these, I traced out the pattern on a piece of cardboard and then transferred that pattern onto a fresh sheet of 1/4-inch MDF. I'd forgotten how much I enjoy working with this material. The jigsaw cut through it like butter. Now, I highly recommend this water-based sanding sealer. It goes on white and is the consistency of milk. I applied 3 coats altogether for each panel so that it had almost a plastic sheen to it. It dries really quickly and is non-toxic. Next, I decided to use a glossy gray for the base color. Then I installed the right panel using pocket hole screws for that in-universe look. For the left side, I decided to add a decorative panel to give it a bit more depth. I had a scrap piece of 1/4-inch MDF that was just the right size. I measured and marked out the design, then used my jigsaw and my bandsaw to cut it all out. I then used the same water-based sanding sealer to prep the MDF for paint. It also works very well on the edges, which is usually the most porous and difficult to get the paint to stick. Once it cured, I gave it a coat of gloss black so it pops off the gray panel. From there, I simply glued the pieces onto the panel. Then I attached the left panel just like the right side using more pocket hole screws. The last step is my second favorite part of every build, weathering. I slathered a watered down mix of black and burnt sienna just as I did on the bench. Let's kick back and enjoy this process together. Something so satisfying about this for me. It pulls everything together for that great used universe look and feel. And here's some shots of the completed piece in its new home. So there you go. A finished Ottoman to complete my Falcon bench and give me an awesome place to sit, to play my guitar, and just kind of finish off, at least for now, my music section of my office. As you can see back here, I have a big blank canvas on both of these walls here that I have got some really cool stuff cooked up and planned for over the next few months. So be sure and stay tuned for that. And until then, build with what you know and figure out the rest.